caught me coughing at the very beginning of this. Good morning and welcome to Becoming a Bible Nerd. We are on chapter 6 and 7 of Esther. So we are almost done. We have one more week left after today. So this morning, as you get on, I am going to, of course, just talk for a minute while people are getting on, and there's nobody out there today, so this is going to be a lot of fun. But we are... the Apostle Paul movie comes out this week. I'm super excited about this. Oh, good morning. There are people out there. The Apostle Paul movie comes out. So those of y'all that studied Acts and 2 Timothy, there's going to be a lot of that in there. It's going to be so much fun. I told Newly last night that I feel like he's my friend, and I can't wait to go and watch it. And I feel like I'll see it in a whole different light because we spent so much time digging in and studying it. And then secondly, while people are getting on, good morning, everybody. Love it when y'all say good morning. One of the things, I've been getting a lot of questions on what devotions and stuff to do with your children. And this whole ministry is about teaching people how to read the Bible. And I'm a huge proponent of, there's tons of tools out there. I even posted some yesterday where you can read and teach biblical principles with your kids. But I think our number one top priority is to teach our children how to read the Bible, because if we don't do it, nobody else will. And you don't want them in their 40s just wandering around and trying to figure it out on their own and finally getting it when they could have had a lifetime of spending time in God's Word, because that's what changes us. It's the only thing out there that has power. So we can read books about God, other people's takes on God, but those things aren't powerful to change us to be more like Him. They just can give us good advice to follow. But there's something with this. Your spirit connects with God's Word. It's living, and it brings change and insight like never before. So what we need to do is slowly teach our kids, like maybe even reading small passages of Scripture, and then get them to think about what it's talking about and how to apply it to their life. Those are the two things. Like, what does it mean here in the text? And then how can we apply it to our life? And so that is the best thing that you can do. Again, I'm doing that with my daughter. She's 7 years old, so it's not like we have to wait until they're seniors in high school or in college before they can do this and learn something from it. So let's get started on chapter 6. I'm going to read verses 1 through 3, if you want to look with me. And it says, "That night, sleep escaped the king, so he ordered the books recording daily events to be brought and read to the king. They found the written report of how Mordecai had informed Bigthana and Teresh," and I'm pretty sure 100% that that's how you really say their name. I'm sure that that's exactly how King Xerxes pronounced their name. "The two eunuchs who guarded the king's entrance when they planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus." Remember, this was at the very beginning. Mordecai happened to be walking along, and he heard about this plot that these two eunuchs were going to assassinate the king, and he goes and tells Esther, and the king is saved. And the king was known for generously rewarding people who did these type of things. But we found out here in verse 3, it says, "The king inquired what honor and special recognition had been given to Mordecai for this act. And the king's personal attendants replied, 'Nothing has been done for him.'" So this is really odd for Xerxes' character to have forgotten Mordecai's good deed. And that's what we're going to talk about today, being forgotten. And the most important thing to know and to take away with this is how you handle yourself in the forgotten season determines the outcome of the next season. I'm going to say that again. How you handle yourself in the forgotten season determines the outcome of the next season. What I'm saying is, whenever you feel like it could be forgotten by God, forgotten by loved ones, forgotten by friends, whatever it is that you're going through, you can choose to live life for yourself and rebel and say, well, hey, nobody cares about me, so I don't care about God's way. Or you can cling to God's promises, dig into the Word, spend more time than you ever have with Him, be completely dependent on Him, and be prepared for the next season that He has. And so almost always this season is preparation for God to use us to impact someone else greatly. So these seasons of isolation, these seasons of forgottenness is preparation for us to do something that is going to impact the lives of others. So we're going to take a look at 3 different people today. The Bible's chock full of these stories, but I picked out 3 that I felt like we could relate with. And the first is Paul in celebration of his movie week. We're going to go to 2 Timothy. You don't have to flip there, but it's 2 Timothy chapter 4. We went through this already last semester, and I just got the honor and privilege to go through it with 2 high school girls, and just to hear their heart ache when they're reading this. I just kept saying, this is just so heartbreaking. It reminded me of what he must have felt like. So Paul is in prison in Rome, and this is shortly before he's going to be beheaded by Caesar Nero. And so he's at the end of his life. He has lived his life. He has run the race. He said that he's poured his life out as a drink offering. He has done everything that he possibly could, and he knows his time is limited. And he's writing Timothy, and this is what he says in verse 9 of chapter 4 in 2 Timothy. This is the letter he's writing. Make every effort to come to see me soon, for Demas has deserted me because he has loved this present world and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Now I'm going to jump to verse 14. Alexander the coppersmith did great harm to me. The Lord will repay him according to his works. And then verse 16. At my defense, no one stood but me. Everyone deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me so that the proclamation might be fully made through me and all Gentiles might hear. And so he's at the end of his life. He's saying that the people that he has invested in, that he has poured into, that he has spent a life serving. He's prayed for these friends. He's poured into them. He's mentored them. He's made sacrifices. He's put his life in danger for these people. His entire life has been about these people and discipling them. And at the end of his life, he's saying that some of these people have deserted him. He's in prison alone. He had to stand before a judge, and no one stood with him. And this is an extremely lonely spot for him. But in this loneliness, it made him make a decision that he could just live in a pity party and feel sorry for himself, or he could totally 100% lean on God. And I think God was teaching him something through this. And through this loneliness and pain, and through leaning on God, he did one thing. He started writing letters. That was the only thing that he could do. And these letters not only taught these new disciples that were going to be the next people to run with the baton, but they are teaching us today. They are still, that time was preparing him for something that was going to affect people for generations to come. So this pain caused him to write. And some of you might be in that situation where, especially if you decide to walk with the Lord, maybe you had some friends before you were a Christian and then you change your life, there's going to be a time in your life where you feel forgotten by these friends. They're not going to want to be around you. They're not going to want to include you in their personal things. And so this can be a great time of pain, but I would say stay faithful with them, because you are a light and you never know when one of them is going to hit rock bottom and you're going to be the person to turn to. Even here, I skipped one of the verses, but he says, only Luke was with me, bring Mark with me, for he's useful in the ministry. There was a time in Acts where Paul and Barnabas were going together doing these missionary journeys, and they ended up parting ways because Barnabas wanted to bring Mark with them, and Paul was like, no, he's deserted us, you can't trust him. And they had such friction about this that they parted ways. But now at the end of his life, you see that there has been restoration there, there's been growth, and there is a friendship now between Mark and Paul, and that is Paul's actually wanting him to come and to comfort him. And so stay faithful even to friends that are not faithful. Be a light to them. You never know whenever they are going to end up back in your life, and you can mentor them. So during these times of, hey, there's my cat in the background. During these times of forgottenness, cling to the Lord. He's preparing you for something big. The next person that we're going to talk about this morning is Joseph. He's one of my favorite characters in the Bible because you just read his life, and I feel like he's always made the right decisions, that he walked in a godly way from his youth. So anyway, Joseph, y'all might know him, a lot of people, as Joseph in the coat of many colors. And his father was Jacob and Rachel. Rachel was one of Jacob's wives. He worked for Rachel's dad for 7 years, but at the end, the dad, Reuben, tricked him and gave him the daughter Leah, so he had to work for 7 more years for Rachel. Well, both of these wives brought their maidservants with them, and so Jacob fathered kids from all 4 of these women, his 2 wives and their maidservants. And so his favorite wife, though, being Rachel, had a son named Joseph, and that was his favorite son because it was a son birthed from his favorite wife. Well, this caused a lot of jealousy amongst the other sons. And then, to make matters worse, when Joseph was young, he told his brothers of 2 dreams that he had, where basically the interpretations of the dreams were that all the brothers were going to bow down to him one day. And this was not just normal sibling rivalry. They literally hated him, and they plotted to kill him. And by the grace of God, he ended up being sold to some slaves instead of being killed. So he ends up in Egypt. So he's forgotten by his family, and he's working for one of the captain of the guard, I think, Potiphar. I forget his job title, but he's a high-ranking official in the government, and he is faithfully serving him in his house. But his wife wants to sleep with Joseph, and Joseph gets out of that situation as quickly as he can. So she accuses him of raping her and is thrown in prison. So even though he's faithful, even though he's making all the right decisions and honoring God, doing the right things, he ends up in prison. So in prison, he decides to still be faithful, and he's given a job to serve some of the king's employees that the king gets mad at, and actually puts these guys in prison. And while he's serving them, they have a dream, and the cupbearer has a dream that he doesn't understand. And Joseph says, I know what this means, that the king is going to, in 3 days, put you back on in his court, and he's going to redeem you. And he gives this cupbearer so much hope. And Joseph says, in return, all I want you to do is remember me. And sadly, in Genesis 40, verse 23, the cupbearer does get to return to the castle to work for Pharaoh. And it says he did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So for two years goes by, Joseph is still in prison, and he's just being as faithful as he can, doing what he can in that season. And Pharaoh has a dream. And then all of a sudden, the cupbearer remembers, hey, there's this guy in prison that I met, and he's really good at interpreting dreams. So, as the story goes, he ends up interpreting these dreams for Pharaoh that there's going to be this great famine in the land, and he even has a plan of action, how to reserve food now so that they can last through this famine. And so Pharaoh ends up elevating him to the most powerful man in all the land. He's the king's right-hand man, becomes very powerful, and he ends up not only feeding the nation of Egypt, but all the surrounding nations. People would come there and live and be able to eat. And so the interesting thing is, if the cupbearer would have remembered Joseph, all that would have happened is maybe he would have been pardoned and set free, and then he would have just lived his life as a regular, ordinary person. But in God's timing, what he does is he prepares our hearts. He changes us almost in a accelerated manner when we are going through these seasons of isolation and forgottenness, because I think we rely on him more than ever before. And because of that, because of the special time that we spend with him, he is able to change us in a more rapid way. But he usually does that not just so that we can be set free and go and live an ordinary life, but so that we can be prepared for something extraordinary to impact lives of others. And so in God's timing, he got this elevation of the most important person in the land, and he literally saves the lives of hundreds of thousands during this famine. And so when God gives us a dream, we need to be busy even in seasons of forgottenness. Joseph was busy in every season that he was in. I know that when I was 20, I didn't really get a promise, but I really felt like God revealed to me what he created me for. And and I could see doors open while I was in Bible school to grow and to be used, and I was so thankful for these things. But then all of a sudden I graduated and I was 21, and I thought, oh, I can't wait to go straight into ministry. And there was actually a pastor from Michigan that came down and spoke at our school for a week. And this happened. They would get pastors in every week that would come for a week and speak to us. He was my favorite one in the 2 years that had a huge church in Michigan. And through a series of crazy events, he met me, his youth pastor heard about me, and the youth pastor flew down to do an interview for me to go work for them. And it was the biggest honor, and I thought, oh, this is so great, all these open doors. And the Lord said no. I felt completely in my spirit that I wasn't supposed to do this. And my series of events led me home, and that was not going to be my dream. And I ended up going and finishing college and becoming a teacher. And I was so confused because I had all these, like I said, I felt like God told me and revealed how He's going to use me in ministry. And my entire 20s, I lived through this lesson. I felt forgotten. My passion, everything within me wanted to be married and start a family, and that did not happen for me until I was almost 29 when I met Newly. So I went through my entire 20s single and wondering when and where and why God hadn't sent Mr. Right. I also, like I said, was teaching and not working in ministry. And I also was serving faithfully at a church that through a series of events, my parents left because of some things that were shady going on. And the pastor was threatened by that and didn't like what was happening. And in the meantime, my mom got cancer. So y'all know that I lost both of my parents during this time. But after I lost my mom, the pastor met with all of my closest friends and their families and told them how dangerous it was to be friends with me because my parents had left and I was going to sow discord and all of these things. So not only was that extremely painful to lose all my friends, but it was in the time of my life that I needed them more than ever before, because at that point in my life, I lived a Leave It to Beaver perfect life. Not that I was perfect. My life, happy family. I went to a good school, got to go to Bible school. Like, I never experienced pain and suffering. And in my darkest time, someone came and manipulated all of my friends to desert me. And so I was all alone. So my 20s, I say these stories to y'all so that you don't have this preconceived notion if you're out there and you're suffering with pain, like, oh, what does she know? Her life is perfect. Because sometimes when we see people in ministry, we think that everything in their life is perfect. And it's not. I know what pain is. I know what that, those times of isolation feels like. So all of that to say that even though I was going through all that, I just remained faithful. I found a new church. I got plugged in where they needed me, and I just did what I could. I found myself in doing a drama team, and that is not anything that I feel gifted at or even have a desire to do, but there was a need, and that's what I was asked to do. So I just remained faithful in doors that were open. And one thing led to another, and eventually I was able to go on staff at my church, which was a dream of mine, and serve in ministry. I still haven't arrived at that season of life where I feel like God told me when I was 20 what I was going to be doing, but I have to believe that this is a road of preparation to get me there 20-something years later. So remain faithful even in those times. So the last person that we're going to talk about this morning is King David. David was first forgotten by his family. There was a time where King Saul, we talked about this at the beginning of Esther, he disobeyed the Lord, a direct order from the Lord. And it was so serious that the Lord was going to take the kingship from Saul, and he was going to look for a new king because he let the people choose Saul. And this time he said, I'm going to choose a king for you. And he told the prophet Samuel to go to Jesse, and he was going to anoint one of his sons. Well, it made most sense to anoint the oldest son. And when the prophet went to the oldest son, the Lord told him no. And so Jesse ends up going to each son in order, and the Lord keeps telling him no. And it finally, Jesse runs out of sons, and the prophet said, well, something's not right. Do you have another son? And he's like, oh, yeah, my little boy David's out in the field. It's like he wasn't even a thought to be considered to be king. His family had forgotten him. His dad had. So as the story goes, he was called in, and he was the one that the Lord had chosen, and he was anointed king. Now, at that time, that didn't mean that he got to be king. There was going to be a season. And at the end of the season, the Lord was going to remove Saul and place David. But he had this knowledge that he was going to be the king. And so what he did was, I feel like, polar opposite of what I would have done. He went the humble route, and he ended up serving King Saul faithfully. He killed the giant Goliath. He played the harp, and that would do something to King Saul's soul and soothe him. He went to war for him. He served him so faithfully. He never had a haughty attitude and like, oh, well, I'm supposed to have your job. He just was a humble servant. And even when what happened was Saul began to hate him and resent him because everything David put his hands to, he would be prosperous. And he became known through all the land of this mighty warrior. And Saul loathed David's success, and he was so jealous of him, so he began to hate him, and he wanted him dead, and he would just throw arrows at him and stuff whenever he was playing the harp. Well, eventually it got so bad that David had to go on the run, and so he runs for his life, and he has to hide out in the wilderness. And in 1 Samuel chapter 22, I'm going to read a verse to you. So he's hiding out in the wilderness. 1 Samuel chapter 22, it says, so David left Gath and took refuge in the cave of Adullam. When David's brothers and his father's whole family heard, they went down to him and joined him there. In addition, every man who was desperate, in debt, and discontented rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. So David has a promise from God to be the next king, but he's finding himself in the caves of Adullam. He's living out in the middle of nowhere, hiding from his life. And something interesting happens here. All of a sudden, desperate people in debt, and discontented people start flocking to him. And they become his people, his mighty men. And so sometimes life's isolations or forgottenness can open doors that we would have never gone through had we not gone through this isolation. I don't think that David's eyes would have been open to these desperate people, these people in debt or discontented people, and said, you know what, I want them to be part of my group, and reached out to them. But he had no choice. God removed him from the palace. He's living in the wilderness, and all of a sudden God's bringing people to him. And David finds himself being faithful in that, and he starts spending time mentoring and training these sad, pathetic people, and they become his mighty men. And I loved that one author said, God uses unusual people to change a culture. Those probably are not the people David would have chosen, but they were the people that God chose to go with him when he was going to become king and change that culture. So he took the open door that he probably never would have taken to love the unlovable. And two quotes that I got studying this. One was, the ways of God are fraught with unfairness, crisis, isolation, and doubt on the road to leadership. So God will bring us through these hardships to build something big in us, to build character and something special. Charles Swindoll said Adullam was the place where God could truly begin to shape David. So David wasn't just another king that Israel experienced. He was the greatest king that Israel had ever seen or known. Others, we read, are going to be handed the kingship on a silver platter, and most of the time they blew it. They went down in the journals of the kings as people who made huge mistakes, or they didn't make a difference, or they even led the kingdom astray. David is known to this day as a mighty warrior who had a heart after God, who changed the face of the nation, but he had to live in the cave of Adullam to get there, to be prepared for it. So these three men, what was the outcome of their isolation? Paul taught nations. His teachings are still affecting Christians today. Joseph fed nations. He literally saved the physical lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and he fed nations. David led the greatest nation known to man, and these tasks would never have been accomplished without these men going through these times of forgottenness and isolation, and in God's timing, he released them. If God does it in our timing when we're praying, then again, we just go and live ordinary lives, but it takes extraordinary. God takes us to the extraordinary when he releases us from that season in his timing. Remember that it's just a season. God's timing is so perfect. Usually he has something much bigger in store, and usually it's not about us. He's preparing us to affect somebody else. Isolation hurts. It stinks. If you read through the Psalms, you're going to see the Psalms of David where he just cries out in desperation for God to move. But being forgotten can birth a desperation in our hearts to become more like Christ. We can do two things. We can either run from God, or we can be so desperate for him that we cling to him with every ounce of our being. It's up to you what your outcome is going to be, because it's up to you how you're going to respond during your wait. And I encourage you, cling to God. Let's look at Esther. So Mordecai was forgotten, but you see that he's faithful. He's constantly in the king's court, and he's constantly still encouraging and mentoring and leading Queen Esther. And I believe that he was forgotten by Xerxes on purpose, because if he would have been rewarded then, it would have just been some small reward that would have lasted a quick, brief amount of time. But in God's timing, he ends up saving a nation using Mordecai. So let me get back to Esther. We flipped all over this morning, and we're just going to sum up. We're almost done. So the king realizes that nothing has been done to Mordecai. So immediately the king's like, who's in the court? Who's coming? Well, Haman happens to have woke up early. He's going to approach the king, tell him about his gallows, and ask permission to hang Mordecai in his gallows. And so he's all bebopping in. He's super excited. He's going to get his revenge on Mordecai. And the king can hear him and says, who's in the court? And they said, oh, it's Haman. So Haman goes in. And he said, yes, king. And the king said, what would you do to honor somebody who did something big? And Haman thinks he's talking about him because he's so prideful. So he comes up with this ridiculous, elaborate thing of how he should be wearing the king's garments, riding on a horse, and somebody should be proclaiming how honorable this man is. And the king said, I love it. You do it for Mordecai. So in a crazy, comical turn of events, Haman has to have his dream accomplished to Mordecai, and he's the one that's leading him through the town and shouting how great Mordecai is, and he is completely and utterly humiliated. It said at the end that he hangs his head and he walks home in shame. And I find this so interesting, and we're going to talk about this in depth next week. But when he gets home, his wife tells him this: since Mordecai is Jewish and you have begun to fall before him, you won't overcome him, because your downfall is certain. While they were still speaking to him, the eunuchs of the king arrived and rushed Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Haman's wife knows that there is no way that he is going to be able to win in this fight with this Jewish nation where God is their king. And so we'll talk about that more next week. But in chapter 7, basically, Esther exposes who she is and lets the king know that Haman has this plot to kill her people. So all of a sudden, the king realizes that his wife has been dishonored, and this is a horrible thing for the person that has done the dishonoring. And so Haman ends up groveling at her feet, wanting her to help him and not, he doesn't want his outcome to be death. And the king walks in, and it looks like Haman is trying to rape her or something, and so that even is worse for him, and he ends up going and getting hung. And the king is furious about this. So we're going to end up here today. We're going to wrap up. We have one more week. I want you to go ahead and read chapters 8, 9, and 10. 10 is super tiny. 8's pretty short. So we are going to be able to finish this up. But we'll talk more about how what Haman's wife was talking about how the Jews can't be defeated next week, and how it's so important for us to back up the Jews. We get blessings and not curses from the Lord when we do this. Anyway, have a great week. I'm glad that it's spring. Happy spring and happy reading.